There's a kind of quiet moment many men notice long before they can explain it. Nothing explodes, no clear argument happens, life on the surface looks mostly the same, but underneath something feels misaligned. The energy shifts. Warmth that used to be easy now feels slightly out of reach. You start sensing distance where closeness once lived, and your mind begins circling questions your heart isn't ready to face. That moment is often the beginning of confusion, not because you lack awareness, but because something subtle has changed in the emotional field between you. Before we go any further, it's important to slow this down. This isn't about blame or panic. It's about understanding psychology in a way that protects your emotional health rather than destabilizes it. What happens after a boundary is crossed in a relationship is rarely loud or obvious at first. More often, it unfolds quietly, internally, especially for the person who crossed that boundary. When a woman does something that violates her own values, the first rupture usually isn't directed outward. It happens inside her. Many men assume that if cheating occurs, what follows is relief, excitement, or emotional clarity. In reality, for a large number of women, the immediate experience is inner conflict. Her self-image, the story she tells herself about who she is, suddenly clashes with what she has done. That collision creates psychological discomfort, and the human mind is wired to resolve discomfort as quickly as possible. This is where behavior begins to change in ways that confuse men. Not because the man did something wrong, but because the woman is now navigating an internal contradiction. Emotional closeness can intensify that contradiction. Intimacy acts like a mirror. It reflects back actions she may not be ready to face. Distance, on the other hand, softens that reflection. So one common response is emotional withdrawal. She may seem cooler, less engaged, or strangely neutral. Not angry, not affectionate, just absent in a way that's hard to describe. This absence is often misread as indifference, but psychologically, it's more accurate to see it as avoidance of inner discomfort. Closeness would demand emotional honesty. Distance creates space where the internal conflict can stay contained. There is another response that can look almost like the opposite. Some women become unusually pleasant after crossing a boundary. They are more agreeable, more attentive, more helpful. This isn't manipulation in a cartoonish sense, it's self-soothing. By acting kind and supportive, she unconsciously reassures herself that she is still a good person. Positive behavior becomes a way to quiet guilt, not necessarily a reflection of renewed intimacy. Men often misinterpret this phase. Warmth feels like reconnection, calm feels like healing. But psychologically, this behavior is often directed inward, not relationally. It's an attempt to stabilize identity, not rebuild trust. Communication also tends to change. Conversations may become lighter, more surface level. Fewer personal disclosures, less emotional risk. This isn't accidental. Depth invites truth, and truth feels threatening when someone is trying to hold conflicting realities at once. So topics are redirected. Emotional conversations are shortened. Humor or practicality replaces vulnerability. Another reaction many men don't expect is irritation. Guilt doesn't always look like remorse. Sometimes it shows up as impatience, criticism, or subtle resentment. This happens because guilt is uncomfortable and the mind looks for ways to release that tension. By focusing on your flaws, your tone, your energy, or small mistakes, attention shifts away from her own internal discomfort. This isn't usually a conscious strategy, it's emotional self-protection. What matters here is not decoding every behavior as proof of anything. Psychology is not a lie detector, it's a lens. And through this lens, what becomes visible is not just what happened, but how emotional responsibility is handled afterward. One of the most important distinctions many men miss is this. What a woman does after cheating often has less to do with the relationship itself and more to do with her capacity to face herself. That capacity, or lack of it, shapes everything that follows. As time passes, the mind looks for relief from inner conflict. And one of the most powerful tools it uses is justification. Humans struggle to live in a state where identity and behavior don't align. To reduce that tension, meaning begins to shift. Facts may remain the same, but interpretation changes. This is where men often feel destabilized. The shared story of the relationship starts to feel rewritten. Moments that were once neutral or positive become reframed as evidence of dissatisfaction. Small disagreements take on new weight. This doesn't mean the past suddenly changed. It means the present needs explanation. If the relationship can be reinterpreted as already broken, distant, or unfulfilling, then the boundary violation feels less like a betrayal and more like a consequence. This process is often unconscious. It's the psyche protecting itself from shame. Language begins to shift subtly. We becomes I. Shared experience becomes personal framing. There is more focus on her feelings, her stress, her needs, and less curiosity about yours. Empathy narrows. Emotional focus contracts. This isn't cruelty, it's containment. Another common response during this phase is compartmentalization. Different parts of life are kept separate to avoid emotional collision. One version of her exists in daily routines with you. Another exists internally, carrying the weight of unresolved guilt. This can create inconsistency, warmth one day, distance the next, presence without accessibility. It's not confusion about you, it's fragmentation within herself. Some women respond to this instability by seeking control. Control creates a sense of grounding when inner balance feels threatened. This may show up as increased monitoring, new boundaries, or guardedness that didn't exist before. Ironically, the person who broke trust may become more private, not because she fears you, but because she fears exposure. Here's an important psychological truth. Guilt does not automatically lead to honesty. In many cases, it delays it. Honesty would collapse the justification system, holding the internal world together. So instead, the mind buys time. Time to see if feelings fade. Time to see if normalcy returns. Time to regain balance without confrontation. During this period, many men make a painful mistake. They lean in harder, they ask more questions, they seek reassurance, they try to restore connection through presence. But emotional pressure rarely creates openness. More often, it pushes people deeper into defense. What actually matters at this stage is not confession, it's responsibility. Responsibility shows up in behavior, consistency, and empathy that doesn't disappear when discomfort arises. And this is where a deeper realization begins to form. After a boundary violation, behavior is shaped less by what happened and more by how willing someone is to sit with the discomfort of who they became in that moment. That willingness determines whether healing is possible or whether confusion continues. This is where we'll pause. In the next part, we'll explore what happens as time goes on, how identity protection deepens, how emotional detachment can evolve, and why your stability becomes more important than her clarity. When you're ready, let me know, and we'll continue. As time moves forward, the emotional landscape continues to shift, often in ways that feel even more confusing than the initial change. The intensity of guilt may soften, but the psychological consequences of carrying it do not simply disappear. Instead, they evolve. At this stage, the issue is no longer just discomfort, it becomes identity protection. When a woman has crossed a line she never imagined herself crossing, her sense of self is under threat. Most people do not see themselves as disloyal or harmful, so the mind searches for ways to restore stability without fully confronting the rupture. One way this happens is through subtle comparison, not always to a specific person, but to an internal idea, an imagined version of ease, excitement, or emotional escape. This comparison quietly shifts her internal benchmark. You may notice that she becomes less patient, harder to please, or less emotionally responsive. Not because you have changed, but because her internal reference point has shifted at the same time. The relationship is now being experienced through a different psychological filter. Emotional withdrawal often deepens here. Eye contact may fade. Physical presence feels thinner. Conversations lose their depth and natural flow. This withdrawal is not always a sign that affection is gone. More often, it's a sign of inner division. Emotional closeness invites vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens the protective narrative she has built to maintain psychological balance. So she stays half present, enough to function, not enough to feel exposed. Some women respond by becoming increasingly self-focused, more attention to appearance, more emphasis on independence, stronger insistence on personal space. This is often misread as preparation to leave or attract someone else. In many cases, it's something different. After a boundary violation, the psyche seeks reassurance, a reminder of agency, a reminder of desirability, a reminder of control. Self-focus becomes a coping mechanism rather than a relational signal. Defensiveness may also increase. Neutral questions can feel intrusive. Gentle curiosity can be met with irritation. This reaction is rarely about the question itself, it's about what the question represents. When the inner world feels fragile, even harmless inquiries can feel threatening because they carry the possibility of exposure. The nervous system reacts before logic has a chance to intervene. What many men don't realize is that at this stage, a woman often has not decided what she wants. She enters a psychological limbo. Part of her wants normalcy. Another part wants relief from guilt. This tension creates inconsistent behavior. Moments of closeness followed by sudden distance. Warmth followed by emotional absence. For the man experiencing it, this phase can feel exhausting. You're constantly recalibrating, unsure whether to lean in or step back, unsure whether connection is being rebuilt or slowly eroded. Here's where a critical shift needs to happen on your side. Your stability becomes more important than her clarity. Emotional steadiness is not indifference, it's self-respect. Psychological health is not measured by how much confusion you can tolerate. It's measured by how clearly you can observe that confusion without losing yourself inside it. As this internal tension continues, a turning point approaches quietly, not through drama but through fatigue. Guilt is heavy, carrying it demands resolution. Eventually, the mind chooses one of two paths: integration or deflection. Integration is rare but powerful. It occurs when a woman begins to accept responsibility internally, even if she hasn't spoken it aloud yet. You'll notice this not through dramatic apologies, but through consistency. Her emotional presence stabilizes. She becomes more attentive to how her actions affect you. There is a grounded softness in her behavior, not exaggerated kindness, not performative affection, just steadiness. She stops avoiding depth. Difficult conversations are allowed to exist without being redirected or shut down. Deflection is far more common. This is when the psyche decides that carrying guilt is too painful. Responsibility begins to shift outward. The relationship becomes the problem. Circumstances become the problem. Over time, you may begin to feel like you are becoming the problem, not through direct accusation, but through tone, distance, and quiet dissatisfaction. Effort is met with neutrality. Support is received but not returned. Nothing you do quite feels right anymore. This is not cruelty. It's psychological displacement. When internal blame feels unbearable, the mind looks for relief elsewhere. At this stage, many women begin emotionally rehearsing an exit, even if they don't consciously plan one. This doesn't always mean leaving physically. Sometimes it means staying while withdrawing emotionally. The relationship continues on the surface, but intimacy fades, structure remains, vulnerability disappears. This is a crucial misunderstanding for many men. Staying does not always mean choosing the relationship. Sometimes it means avoiding the disruption that truth would cause. Familiarity can feel safer than honesty, especially when honesty threatens identity, reputation, or self-image. You may notice emotional unpredictability increase. Some days feel almost normal, other days feel distant and cold. This inconsistency isn't manipulation, it's ambivalence. The inner conflict remains unresolved, and it leaks into behavior. Over time, this becomes draining for both of you. This is where your role matters, not as a fixer, but as a grounded observer. Chasing reassurance during this phase often backfires. It adds pressure. Pressure strengthens deflection. Calm presence, clear boundaries, and emotional self-containment send a different psychological signal. I'm stable with or without clarity. That signal does something important. It removes distraction. Without the distraction of your reaction, she is left alone with her choices. At that point, integration becomes possible, or deflection becomes unmistakable. What happens next depends less on what she feels and more on what she can face. Feelings fluctuate, character doesn't. And this is where the deeper lesson begins to crystallize. After cheating, behavior is not just about remorse or desire. It's about whether someone has the courage to confront discomfort without rewriting reality to escape it. As this process continues, another defining pattern often appears: emotional minimization. The significance of what happened begins to shrink in language, reactions, and framing. Not because it was insignificant, but because carrying its full weight has become unbearable. Minimization is not denial, it's reduction. You may hear softer phrasing, contextual framing, focus on timing, stress, or emotional states. The impact is subtly dulled. This allows daily life to continue without fully confronting the breach of trust. At the same time, there may be a push toward moving forward before understanding what was broken. Closure is suggested before clarity is reached. This can be deeply unsettling, not because you want to stay in pain, but because something important feels bypassed. Progress without truth creates an emotional imbalance. Routine returns. Conflict is avoided. There is a quiet hope that time alone will smooth what honesty would disrupt. But unresolved experiences don't disappear. They settle beneath the surface and shape the relationship in ways that are hard to name. You may also notice selective engagement, investment in certain areas, kindness here, support there, while other areas remain closed. This creates the illusion of balance, but intimacy is not built from fragments. It requires wholeness, and wholeness requires truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. This phase often tests a man's sense of worth. You may start questioning whether your needs are too much, whether you are overthinking, whether asking for emotional responsibility is unreasonable. These doubts are understandable, but they are also signals. When emotional reality is consistently softened or bypassed, the burden of adjustment shifts to the person who feels it most. What matters now is not confrontation. It's clarity. Clarity about what emotional responsibility looks like to you. Clarity about the difference between forgiveness and avoidance. Forgiveness is an internal release. Avoidance is an external performance. One leads to peace. The other leads to quiet erosion. In the final part, we'll explore how emotional balance begins to shift between you, how unspoken rules form, and why reclaiming your emotional authorship becomes the most important step forward. When you're ready, confirm, and I'll continue with part 3. As the process continues, the focus quietly shifts again, but this time it is no longer centered on her inner world. It moves into the space between you. After avoidance, justification, distancing, and minimization have all had time to settle, something subtle begins to reorganize itself. The emotional balance of the relationship changes, not through arguments or ultimatums, but through unspoken adjustment. If accountability has not been fully integrated, the relationship often forms a silent agreement. Certain topics are avoided, certain emotions feel inconvenient. You may sense that maintaining calm requires restraint on your part, that asking for reassurance creates tension, that expressing hurt feels disruptive rather than welcomed. This is not because your needs are unreasonable, it's because unresolved guilt reshapes the emotional rules of engagement. Without realizing it, many men begin carrying emotional weight that does not belong to them. They become more careful with words, more forgiving of inconsistency, more willing to self-silence in the name of peace. This often feels like maturity. It can even look like strength. But psychologically, it is overfunctioning. And over time, overfunctioning leads to erosion. You may notice yourself becoming hyper-aware of her moods, adjusting your behavior to maintain stability, managing emotional climate rather than sharing emotional reality. This does not happen because you are weak. It happens because you care. But care without reciprocity slowly disconnects you from your own emotional center. At this stage, something important becomes clear. Stability without vulnerability is not healing. It is suspension, and suspension cannot last indefinitely. Eventually, something gives, intimacy fades, resentment grows, or self-respect begins asking questions you can no longer ignore. This is where reclaiming emotional authorship matters. Emotional authorship does not mean confrontation or control. It means staying connected to your own truth without aggression. It means recognizing that your need for clarity, safety, and emotional reciprocity is not excessive. It is human. A grounded man does not beg for emotional responsibility. He does not chase it. He creates an environment where responsibility is either met or its absence becomes visible. That clarity does something powerful. It removes confusion, it replaces guessing with observation. This is often when emotional stillness arrives. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no explosion or revelation. But internally, something settles. You stop interpreting inconsistency as mystery. You stop confusing endurance with love. You begin to notice the difference between peace that comes from emotional safety and peace that comes from emotional avoidance. And that awareness leads to the most important realization of all. What a woman does after cheating is not a universal script. Some people integrate responsibility, many avoid it. But the deeper truth is that her behavior becomes a mirror, not of your worth, but of her relationship with accountability. Once you see that clearly, something steadies inside you. Confusion loses its grip. You understand that emotional inconsistency was never complexity, it was unresolved conflict. And your instinct to seek clarity was not weakness, it was your nervous system asking for safety. Emotionally mature men eventually learn this. Trust is not rebuilt through time alone. It is rebuilt through congruence, through words and actions aligning, through discomfort being faced rather than managed. When that congruence is absent, patience cannot substitute for it. This realization does not harden you, it softens you in the right places. You stop personalizing another person's avoidance. You stop measuring your value by someone else's willingness to be honest. You stop negotiating with dynamics that quietly ask you to disappear. If accountability is present, you will feel it not as reassurance, but as relief. Your body relaxes, your mind stops scanning. Emotional safety returns gradually and naturally. If it is not present, something else arrives instead: clarity. And while clarity can be uncomfortable at first, it is deeply stabilizing. The purpose of understanding this psychology was never to catch, expose, or punish. It was to see clearly without losing yourself, to respond rather than react, to remain grounded in your values even when the ground felt uncertain. This is the truth many men carry with them once they understand it. Betrayal does not destroy your capacity to trust. It sharpens your discernment. It does not make you guarded. It makes you awake. And when you are awake, you choose differently. You rebuild with open eyes, or you step forward with self-respect intact. Either way, you remain whole. Emotional integrity is not loud. It does not demand or chase. It stands quietly in truth and allows everything else to reveal itself. And that quiet strength, more than any answer or confession, is what ultimately defines the man you become.